I live in a small apartment downtown that's filled with more law books than furniture, a consequence of my job as a public defender. My life is a carefully constructed routine of case files, lukewarm coffee, and the quiet, persistent hum of fighting for people the world has forgotten. But that routine was about to be shattered by a face from a past I didn't even know I had. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. The air in courtroom 4B of the Montgomery County Courthouse was thick with the familiar scent of old paper, cheap wood polish, and stale desperation. It was a smell I had grown accustomed to over my 4 years as a public defender, a scent that clung to the back of your throat and reminded you that for most people who entered this room, the scales of justice felt impossibly heavy on one side. I sat at the defense table, my worn leather briefcase beside me, trying to project an aura of confidence I didn't entirely feel. My client, Daniel Miller, sat ramrod straight, his hands clasped so tightly on his lap they were bloodless. He was 21, a good kid from a rough neighborhood who was accused of shoplifting a laptop from a big-box electronics store. The evidence was flimsy, a grainy security video showing someone with a similar build wearing a generic hoodie. But the district attorney's office was pushing hard, eager to make an example of someone, anyone, to show they were tough on crime. My job was to be the shield between Daniel and a system that was ready to chew him up and spit him out. I had spent the last week preparing, poring over discovery, filing motions, and coaching Daniel on how to present himself. Today was the pre-trial hearing, a routine affair where we'd argue a motion to suppress the security footage. The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Samuel Croft, a man with a formidable reputation. He was known for his sharp intellect, his merciless efficiency, and a demeanor that could freeze boiling water. I had never argued before him, but his legend preceded him. He was a pillar of the legal community, a man whose political star was rumored to be on the rise. To him, this case was likely nothing more than a tiny blip on his docket, another piece of administrative debris to be swept away. The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of lawyers talking to clients and clerks shuffling papers. I gave Daniel a small, reassuring nod. "Just breathe, Daniel," I whispered. "We've got this. Stick to the facts. We're just arguing about the video quality today." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm trying, Ms. Reed." My name wasn't Reed. My name was Aurora Vance. My older sister, Clara, had married young and taken the name Reed before she passed away 10 years ago. Sometimes, when I was under immense pressure, I would accidentally think of myself with her last name, a strange phantom limb of memory. It was a momentary slip, a ghost in my own head. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and Judge Samuel Croft swept in, his black robes billowing like a dark cloud. He was exactly as described, tall, with a mane of silver hair, a square jaw, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He moved with an innate, unshakable authority, settling into his high-backed leather chair and surveying the room as if it were his personal kingdom. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the microphone on his bench. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. He began working through the morning's docket, his rhythm brisk and impatient. He dispatched with 3 cases in less than 20 minutes, his rulings sharp and final. He was a machine. Finally, he called our case. The People versus Daniel Miller. Docket number 7-3-2-9B. I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as I stood, my papers arranged neatly on the lectern in front of me. I smoothed the front of my blazer. "Aurora Vance for the defense, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And with me is my client, Mr. Daniel Miller." The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Peterson, gave his own introduction. Judge Croft nodded, his gaze fixed on the file in front of him. He hadn't looked at me yet. He was reading the motion I had filed, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ms. Vance," he began, his eyes still on the page, your motion to suppress argues that the security footage is of such poor quality as to be unduly prejudicial. You claim the identification is impossible to make with any reasonable degree of certainty. Is that the sum of it? That is the core of our argument, Your Honor, I replied. The footage fails to establish identity beyond a reasonable doubt, and its inclusion would serve only to prejudice the jury against my client, who has no prior record. He finally lifted his head, ready to hear my oral argument, and his eyes met mine. And then, the world stopped. The machine broke. The formidable, unshakable Judge Samuel Croft froze. It wasn't a subtle pause. It was a complete and utter system failure. His mouth, which had been poised to speak, remained slightly open. The pen in his hand, which had been tapping a rhythm on his desk, slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the polished wood, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence that had suddenly fallen. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. His eyes, which had been sharp and dismissive moments before, were now wide, locked on my face with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a look of someone who had just seen a ghost. The silence stretched from 1 second to 5, then to 10. It became awkward, then palpable. Lawyers in the gallery began to murmur. The court reporter looked up from her machine, her fingers hovering over the keys. Peterson, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Even Daniel glanced at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. I stood frozen at the lectern, my own mind racing. Did I have something on my face? Did I say something wrong? I replayed my introduction in my head. Aurora Vance for the defense. It was my name. Nothing was out of place. Your Honor? Peterson ventured cautiously. Judge Croft didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear him. He was still staring at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. It wasn't just recognition, it was something deeper, something laced with horror. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his bench. He looked like he was fighting for air. Finally, he blinked, as if waking from a trance. He took a shaky breath and visibly tried to compose himself, straightening his robes and fumbling to pick up his pen. "Forgive me," he said, his voice a strained, unfamiliar rasp. A momentary distraction. He looked down at the file, but I could see his hands were trembling slightly. He wouldn't look at me again. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice now clipped and harsh, "proceed with your argument." I tried to gather my thoughts, my own composure rattled by his bizarre reaction. I launched into my argument, citing case law and precedent, but my words felt hollow. The entire incident had thrown the courtroom off its axis. The judge's focus was gone. "We are in recess until 2 o'clock. Without another word, he stood up and swept out of the courtroom through his private door, his movements stiff and hurried. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lawyers huddled together, speculating. "Did you see that? What was wrong with him? Never seen Croft lose his cool like that." I sank into my chair, my heart pounding. Daniel looked at me, his young face etched with worry. "What was that all about, Ms. Vance?" He looked at you like he knew you. "I don't know, Daniel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I've never seen that man before in my life." But as I said the words, a sliver of doubt entered my mind. His reaction wasn't just strange, it was personal. He hadn't just been distracted. He had been terrified. Judge Samuel Croft had looked at me and seen something that shook him to his very core. And I had absolutely no idea what it was. The case of Daniel Miller had just become infinitely more complicated, and a chilling sense of foreboding settled over me. This was no longer just about a stolen laptop. Something dark and forgotten had been awakened in courtroom 4B. The rest of the day passed in a blur of confusion. I tried to focus on the next steps for Daniel's case, but my mind kept replaying the scene in the courtroom. The image of Judge Croft's face, pale, shocked, almost horrified, was seared into my brain. It was the face of a man who had seen the impossible. When I met with Daniel in one of the courthouse's small, windowless conference rooms, he was understandably spooked. He was a smart kid, a community college student working 2 jobs to help his mom pay rent. His whole life, he'd been told to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. Now, through no fault of his own, he was trapped in a legal nightmare, and the judge presiding over his fate had just had a complete meltdown at the sight of his lawyer. "He hates me, doesn't he?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "That's why he denied the motion." "Because of you." "No, Daniel, that's not it," I reassured him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Judges are supposed to be impartial. His personal feelings, whatever they are, have no bearing on the facts of this case. His ruling was weak, and it gives us grounds for an appeal if we need it. But I knew it wasn't that simple. A biased judge could destroy a case in 1,000 subtle ways. He could sustain the prosecution's objections and overrule mine. He could limit the scope of my cross-examinations. He could give unfavorable instructions to the jury. With his ruling on the motion, Judge Croft had already fired the first shot. He was signaling that there would be no leniency here. The case itself should have been straightforward. Daniel had been in the vicinity of the electronics store around the time of the theft. The real thief had ditched the laptop in a nearby alley, where it was later found. The only thing connecting Daniel to the crime was the security footage, which showed a person of his approximate height and ethnicity, wearing a dark blue hoodie. Daniel owned a dark blue hoodie, as did half the young men in the city. There was no facial identification, no fingerprints, no other witnesses. The prosecution's case was a house of cards, but in Judge Croft's courtroom, it seemed that house was being built on a foundation of solid rock. After I left the courthouse, I walked aimlessly for a few blocks, the city noise doing little to quiet the chaos in my head. I had built my life on logic and reason. Facts, evidence, precedent, those were the tools of my trade. But there was no logical explanation for what had happened today. I had never met Judge Samuel Croft. I would have remembered. His was a face often in the legal journals and occasionally in the local news. I was certain our paths had never crossed. So why the reaction? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Did I resemble someone from his past who had wronged him? A former lover, a rival, a defendant he'd sent to prison years ago? The possibilities were endless and unsettling. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Ben Carter. Ben was an investigative journalist for the city's last remaining independent newspaper. He was sharp, relentless, and had a healthy disdain for authority, which made us natural allies. He often lingered around the courthouse, sniffing out stories that the bigger outlets missed. His text read, "Coffee? Heard things got weird in 4B this morning." Croft looked like he'd seen a ghost. And you were the ghost. I agreed to meet him at a small cafe near my office. When I walked in, he was already there, hunched over a laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up and gave me a tired smile. "Aurora. You look like you could use something stronger than coffee." "You have no idea," I sighed, sliding into the booth opposite him. I recounted the morning's events, describing the judge's reaction in detail, the dropped pen, the loss of color, the fear in his eyes. Ben listened intently, his journalistic instincts on high alert. "And you're absolutely sure you've never met him?" he asked when I finished. "Never. Not at a conference, not at a bar association mixer, nowhere." "What about your family?" Ben pressed. "Is there any connection?" "Your parents, maybe?" I shook my head. My dad was a history teacher and my mom was a librarian. They passed away years ago. They weren't connected to the legal world. My only other family was my sister, Clara, and she died when I was 19. I rarely spoke about Clara. The pain was still a tender bruise, even after a decade. She was 8 years my senior, a whirlwind of vibrant energy and reckless charm who had lived a fast, tumultuous life. Her death had been sudden, a tragic car accident on a rain-slicked highway. Ben's expression softened. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay," I said quickly. "It was a long time ago." We sat in silence for a moment, the aroma of roasted coffee beans filling the air. "Well," Ben said, leaning forward, "a guy like Samuel Croft doesn't get rattled for no reason. He's ex-military, former top prosecutor. They call him the Hammer. For him to lose his composure like that in open court, it means something, Aurora. Something big." "But what?" I asked, frustrated. "What could it possibly be?" "I don't know yet," Ben admitted. "But I'm going to do some digging. Croft is being vetted for a federal judgeship. He's got skeletons, they all do. Maybe you just happen to look like one of them." He told me he would start by looking into Croft's career history, particularly his time as a prosecutor. He'd check for old cases, any controversies, anything that had been swept under the rug. I left the cafe feeling a little less alone but no less confused. The case of Daniel Miller was no longer just about defending a client. It had become tangled with a mystery that was deeply, and unnervingly, personal. Back in my office, surrounded by the comforting clutter of case files, I tried to push the judge out of my mind and focus on Daniel. I had to build a defense. I started by re-examining the discovery files. I pulled up the crime scene photos, the police report, the witness statements. The store's loss prevention officer, a man named Henderson, was the one who had called the police and identified Daniel as the suspect he'd seen fleeing the area. His statement was confident, almost too confident. I decided to start there. I would re-interview Henderson. I'd go to the store myself, walk the path the thief took, and time it. I'd look for other cameras in the area, ones the police might have missed. I had to create reasonable doubt. I had to show the jury that the state's case was nothing but smoke and mirrors. But as I worked late into the night, the fluorescent lights of my office humming overhead, a cold thought kept intruding. What if this wasn't just about reasonable doubt anymore? What if, in order to save Daniel, I first had to understand why Judge Samuel Croft looked at me and saw a ghost? The fate of my client, and perhaps my own sanity, seemed to depend on it. The path forward was forked. One way led to a conventional defense. The other led down a dark, unknown road into a powerful man's past. I had a feeling I would have to travel both. The following days were a study in cognitive dissonance. By day, I was the diligent public defender, meticulously preparing for Daniel's trial. I spent hours at the law library, researched jury selection strategies, and drafted a blistering cross-examination for the prosecution's key witness. I met with Daniel and his mother, projecting an unwavering belief in our chances. But by night, I was a woman haunted. The image of Judge Croft's face was a constant, unwelcome guest in my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his shocked expression, and the question echoed in the dark, why? I knew Ben was digging into Croft's professional history, so I decided to look elsewhere. I turned inward, to my own past. Maybe the answer wasn't in his life, but in mine. That weekend, I drove 2 hours out of the city to my childhood home. After my parents died, the house had been sold, but there were boxes of our family's things stored in my aunt's attic, a dusty archive of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. My aunt greeted me with a warm hug and a cup of tea, her brow furrowed with concern. I told her I was just feeling nostalgic and wanted to look through some old photos. I didn't mention the judge. I couldn't explain it to her when I couldn't even explain it to myself. The attic was hot and smelled of cedar and decay. Sunlight streamed through a single grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. I found the boxes labeled Vance and began to pry them open. The first few were filled with my parents' things, my father's collection of history books, my mother's photo albums from her college days. Then I found the boxes that held my childhood, and more importantly, my sister's. Clara had been the sun around which our family orbited. She was beautiful, impulsive, and fearless. While I was the quiet, studious one with my nose in a book, Clara was out living, making mistakes, and collecting stories. She was my hero and my tormentor, my protector and my biggest rival. I sifted through old report cards, concert ticket stubs, and dried-out corsages. Then, I found her photo albums. I sat on the dusty floorboards and began to turn the pages. There was Clara at her high school graduation, beaming, a diploma in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other. There she was on a beach trip with friends, her arm thrown around a boy with a surfer's tan. Her life flashed by in glossy 4x6 prints. As I got to the last album, the photos became less frequent. This was from the last year of her life, when she was 27. She had moved to the city, working a series of odd jobs, her life a bit of a mystery to us. She was thinner in these pictures, her smile a little more brittle, her eyes holding a shadow I hadn't recognized at the time. And then I saw it. It was a single photograph, tucked into the back sleeve of the album, not mounted on the page like the others. It was a picture of Clara, smiling radiantly, standing on a boat. Her hair was blowing in the wind, and she looked happier than I had seen her in years. Her arm was linked with a man's. He was older, dressed in an expensive-looking polo shirt, his expression confident and possessive. He had dark hair then, not silver, and his face was younger, less lined, but there was no mistaking him. It was Samuel Croft. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I stared at the photograph, the dusty attic air suddenly feeling thin and suffocating. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Samuel Croft and my sister? I pulled the photo out of its plastic sleeve. On the back, in Clara's looping, dramatic handwriting, were two words, Sam. The future. Sam. My mind reeled. I tried to make sense of it. Clara had never mentioned to Sam she had talked about boyfriends, but never anyone this much older, this substantial. A man like Samuel Croft, even a younger version of him, was not someone you forgot to mention. He would have been a rising star in the DA's office at the time. A man with a bright future. A future Clara had apparently thought she was a part of. My hands trembling, I dug deeper into the box. Underneath the photo albums was a stack of her journals, bound in worn leather. I had never read them. After her death, it felt like a violation of her privacy. Now, it felt like a necessity. I opened the last one, from the year she died. Her entries were sporadic, filled with frantic energy. She wrote about parties, about feeling lost, about wanting more from her life. And then, I found him. She never used his full name, only S. S says I have to be patient, one entry read. He has a plan for us. A wife to get rid of, a career to protect. He says a man in his position has to be careful. But oh, the way he looks at me. I know he means it. He's going to leave her. He promised. My blood ran cold. Wife. Samuel Croft was married. I knew that. His wife was a prominent socialite. He had 2 grown children. He had been married for over 30 years. He had been married then. My sister was having an affair with a powerful, married prosecutor. I kept reading, my horror growing with every page. Clara wrote about secret meetings in fancy hotels, expensive gifts, and promises of a life together once his divorce was finalized. But then the tone of the entries began to change. S is getting distant. He's always so stressed about work. He got a big promotion. He says we have to be more careful than ever. I told him my news today. I thought he'd be happy. He wasn't. The entry was dated 2 weeks before her accident. My news. I knew, with a sickening certainty, what she meant. I flipped frantically through the last few pages. Her handwriting grew more erratic, filled with fear and desperation. He says it will ruin him. He called it a complication. He gave me money. He told me to take care of it. He doesn't understand. This is our baby. Our future. Why doesn't he see that? And the final entry, dated the day before her accident, he's coming over tonight. To talk. He says he has a solution. I'm so scared. He sounded so cold. This isn't the S I know. I don't know who he is anymore. That was it. The next page was blank. The next day, she was dead. Her car had gone off a bridge on a rainy night. The police had ruled it an accident. A tragic, simple accident. I sat there in the silence of the attic, the journal open in my lap, the photograph of my smiling sister and her powerful lover lying beside me. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. He had a solution. Judge Samuel Croft, the man who held my client's future in his hands, was the secret that had died with my sister. He had promised her a future, and then, when she and their unborn child became an inconvenience to his ambition, he had erased them. He had gotten away with it for a decade. He had built his perfect life and his perfect career on the wreckage of hers. And now, her ghost had walked into his courtroom. Not Clara. Me. Her sister. The spitting image of her, 10 years younger. No wonder he looked like he'd seen a ghost. In a way, he had. He had seen the one person on earth who could unravel his perfect life. He had seen his past and his judgment walking toward him. The 2-hour drive back to the city was a silent, agonizing journey through a landscape of newfound horror. The journal and the photograph were on the passenger seat beside me, feeling less like mementos and more like evidence in a crime I was just beginning to understand. My grief for Clara, which had settled into a dull, chronic ache over the years, was now raw and immediate, sharpened by the jagged edges of betrayal and rage. She hadn't just died. She had been discarded. Her life, her love, her child, all deemed complications to be solved by a man ruthlessly climbing the ladder of power. A man who now wore the robes of a judge. A man who was about to preside over my case. The moment I got back to my apartment, I called Ben Carter. My voice was shaky, but my resolve was like steel. Meet me at my office. Now, I said. I've found it. I know why he froze. When Ben arrived, I had the photograph and the open journal laid out on my desk under the harsh light of my desk lamp. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I just pointed. That's my sister, Clara. And that's a 20 years younger Samuel Croft. Ben picked up the photo, his eyes wide. He looked from the picture to me and back again. The resemblance is uncanny, he breathed. You have her eyes. I pushed the journal towards him and summarized what I'd read. I told him about the affair, the pregnancy, the promises, and the final, chilling entry. By the time I finished, the silence in my office was heavy and profound. Ben leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his already messy hair. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly shocked. Aurora, if this is true, this isn't just a scandal. This is a potential homicide. I know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But how do we prove it? This journal is just the word of a dead woman. The police ruled her death an accident a decade ago. Croft was a powerful prosecutor then, he's a powerful judge now. He'll bury us. Maybe, Ben said, a familiar glint of determination returning to his eyes. But he was sloppy. He left a trail because he never imagined anyone would ever come looking for it. We just have to find it. And so began our own investigation, a clandestine operation run out of my cramped office and his cluttered news desk. We worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and a shared sense of righteous fury. Ben, with his journalist credentials, started digging into the official records. He pulled the original police report and the coroner's inquest from Clara's accident. On the surface, everything looked clean. The report concluded she had lost control of her car on a wet road. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with the crash. There was no autopsy performed, deemed unnecessary for a straightforward traffic fatality. No autopsy, Ben muttered, poring over the documents. Convenient. That's the first red flag. For a single car fatality with no witnesses, an autopsy should have been standard procedure. He discovered that the lead detective on the case had taken early retirement just 6 months later, moving to Florida with a pension that seemed surprisingly generous. The on-call coroner who had signed the death certificate had a history of alcoholism and had his license revoked 2 years later for falsifying reports in an unrelated case. Coincidences? Maybe. But the pattern was damning. While Ben chased the official paper trail, I focused on the personal one. I went back to Clara's journal, reading it cover to cover, searching for any detail that could be corroborated. She mentioned names of restaurants where she met S, the name of a jewelry store where he bought her a bracelet, a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. These were our breadcrumbs. Our first breakthrough came from the jewelry store. It was a long shot, but I went there with a picture of Clara. The owner had retired, but his son, who now ran the shop, remembered her. "Yeah, I remember her," he said, squinting at the photo. "She used to come in here with a guy. An older fellow, real intense. Always paid cash." He didn't remember the name, but he remembered a specific piece of jewelry, a delicate gold bracelet with a single diamond charm. Clara had written about it in her journal, a gift from S for her birthday. The second breakthrough was even bigger. I found the lakeside cabin. Clara had described it as our secret place. It was in a small, sleepy town 3 hours away. Acting on a hunch, I searched property records from that era and found a cabin registered to a shell corporation. Ben used his sources to trace the corporation's ownership. It led back to Samuel Croft's former law partner. He had used his friend's name to hide his ownership of the place where he conducted his affair. Ben and I drove out to the cabin one Saturday. It was deserted, a layer of dust covering everything. It was like a time capsule from their affair. We didn't know what we were looking for, but we searched every inch of it. In a locked desk drawer, which Ben managed to jimmy open with a credit card, we found a small, velvet-covered box. Inside was the gold bracelet with the diamond charm. He had taken it back. Perhaps after she died, he had come here to erase any evidence of their connection, and in his haste, he had forgotten this one small thing. But next to the bracelet was something else. A small slip of paper. It was a receipt from a pharmacy, dated 2 days before Clara's death. It was for a prescription. The name on the prescription was not Clara's. It was for a powerful sedative, the kind that could cause drowsiness and impaired judgment. The prescribing doctor was a known associate of Croft's, and the patient's name was one I didn't recognize. It was almost certainly a fake name, used to acquire the drugs without a trail leading back to him. We stood in the dusty cabin, the receipt in Ben's hand, the bracelet in mine. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place, they were forming a clear, monstrous picture. Croft hadn't physically pushed her car off that bridge. He didn't have to. He had dinner with her that night, his solution in hand. He could have easily slipped the sedatives into her drink. He knew she had a long, treacherous drive home in the rain. He had orchestrated her death and made it look like an accident. He had planned it all. He had played judge, jury, and executioner to the woman who loved him and the child she carried, all to protect his own ambition. "We have it, Ben," I said, my voice trembling with a decade's worth of suppressed rage. "This is it. It's enough for a story," he said grimly. "It's enough to ruin him publicly. But it's not enough to convict him of murder in a court of law. It's still circumstantial. His lawyers would tear it apart." I knew he was right. Going to the police now, with this evidence, would trigger a war. Croft would use every bit of his power and influence to crush us. He would paint me as a grieving, vindictive sister, and Ben as a fame-hungry journalist. He would walk away clean, again. And Daniel Miller's trial was in 1 week. Croft would still be on the bench, ready to make an example of my client as a warning to me. No, a newspaper story wasn't enough. The police weren't enough. If I wanted true justice for Clara, I had to get it myself. And there was only one place to do that. It wasn't in the past. It was in the future. In his courtroom. In front of the world. I had to face him where he was strongest, and turn his own kingdom into his prison. The week leading up to Daniel Miller's trial was the longest of my life. I was living a double existence. On one level, I was a defense attorney on the brink of a major case, spending my days in strategy sessions, prepping my client, and preparing my opening statement. But on another, deeper level, I was the architect of a plan so audacious, so dangerous, that it could end my career or, if I was truly unlucky, my life. Samuel Croft was not just a judge, he was a killer who had gotten away with it. There was no telling what he would do if he felt cornered. Ben was terrified for me. "Aurora, this is insane," he argued during one of our late-night sessions in my office, surrounded by maps of the accident site and copies of Clara's journal. "You can't confront him in open court. That's not how the system works. He'll have you cited for contempt and thrown in jail before you can get 2 words out. Let me run the story first. We can force a judicial inquiry. And what happens then?" I shot back, pacing the length of my small office. "He gets suspended, maybe. He hires the best lawyers money can buy. They'll discredit the evidence, discredit me, discredit Clara's memory. It will be a circus, and he'll be the ringmaster. And in the meantime, what happens to Daniel Miller? Croft will bury him under the jail as a message to me. No, Ben. This has to happen on my terms. In the one place where he is supposed to be a symbol of justice, not a perversion of it." My plan was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. I couldn't just stand up and accuse him. I had to use the rules of evidence and courtroom procedure to lay a trap. I had to make my accusations on the record, forcing them into the official transcript of the trial, where they could not be erased. Daniel's case was my vehicle. The charge was shoplifting, but the trial was going to be for murder. The first step was to ensure the trial proceeded. I waived our right to a jury, a move that stunned the prosecutor. "Are you sure, Ms. Vance?" Peterson asked, a smug look on his face. "You want Judge Croft to be the sole decider of fact?" He thought I was a fool, or that I was trying some bizarre reverse psychology. He didn't understand that I didn't want a jury. I wanted Croft. I needed his full, undivided attention. A bench trial was perfect. It would be just him, me, and the truth. Next, I had to find a way to introduce my evidence. The photograph, the journal, the pharmacy receipt, none of it had any legal relevance to whether Daniel Miller stole a laptop. If I tried to introduce them, the prosecution would object, and Croft would sustain the objection. I needed a backdoor. My backdoor was the prosecution's star witness, the loss prevention officer, Mr. Henderson. His testimony was the cornerstone of their case. He was the one who claimed to have seen Daniel running from the scene. My cross-examination of Henderson would be my stage. I spent 3 solid days researching Henderson. I ran a background check. He was a retired cop with a spotless record. But Ben's journalistic instincts paid off. He found something the background check missed. 15 years ago, Henderson had been a patrolman in the same precinct where Croft was a rising prosecutor. They weren't friends, but they had worked in the same building for years. It was a thin connection, but it was a start. My plan began to form. I wouldn't just question Henderson about the shoplifting. I would question his character, his memory, his motivations. I would use the rules of cross-examination, which are much broader than direct examination, to sow doubt. And in that doubt, I would plant my seeds. The night before the trial, I sat alone in my apartment. The evidence was laid out on my coffee table, a copy of the picture of Clara and Croft, a few photocopied pages from her journal, the receipt from the pharmacy, and a certified copy of her death certificate. This was my ammunition. Tomorrow, I was going to war. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose. I was no longer just Daniel's lawyer. I was Clara's voice. I was doing this for the sister I had lost, for the niece or nephew I never got to meet, and for the scared, 21-year-old kid who was caught in the crossfire of a decade-old crime. This was the point of no return. If I failed, I would lose everything, my case, my career, my credibility. Croft would be untouchable, and the truth would be buried forever. But if I succeeded, I would not only get justice for my sister, but I would expose a monster hiding in plain sight. I picked up the picture of Clara. She was smiling, so full of life and hope, so unaware of the darkness lurking behind the charming smile of the man beside her. "I'm sorry it took me so long, Clara," I whispered to the photograph. "But I'm here now. And tomorrow, he's going to finally answer for what he did to you." I packed the documents carefully into a sealed evidence folder inside my briefcase. I ironed my best suit. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I was ready. The next day, in courtroom 4B, the trial of the people versus Daniel Miller would begin. But the real defendant, the man sitting high on the bench, had no idea that his own judgment day had finally arrived. The morning of the trial, courtroom 4B felt like a pressure cooker. The air was still and heavy. Ben Carter sat in the front row of the gallery, his reporter's notebook open, his expression tense. Daniel Miller sat beside me, his suit slightly too big for him, his face pale. I gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "Stay calm, Daniel. Just tell the truth. I'll handle the rest." He nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. Across the room, Prosecutor Peterson was practically buzzing with confidence. A bench trial before the notoriously tough-on-crime Judge Croft? This was a gift. He thought he had an easy win. He had no idea what was coming. "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. Judge Samuel Croft entered the room. He looked tired, older than he had just a week ago. There were dark circles under his eyes. He had clearly not been sleeping well. He avoided looking at me as he took his seat, his gaze fixed on the court file in front of him. He knew I was Clara's sister now, he must have spent the week confirming it. He was on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He just didn't know how, or when. The trial began. Peterson presented his case with brisk efficiency. He called the store manager, who testified about the stolen laptop. He called the police officer who recovered it. And then he called his star witness. The people call Mr. Gerald Henderson to the stand. Henderson was a man in his late 50s, with a stocky build and a self-assured demeanor. He walked to the witness stand with the confidence of a man who was used to being believed. He recounted his version of events. He saw the thief run out of the store, pursued him briefly, and saw him duck into an alley. A few minutes later, he saw Daniel Miller emerge from the same alley. Under Peterson's gentle questioning, he was unshakable. "And are you certain the man you saw coming out of the alley was the defendant, Mr. Miller?" Peterson asked. "Absolutely certain," Henderson said, pointing a thick finger at Daniel. "That's him." Peterson smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. No further questions." He sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. Now it was my turn. I stood and walked to the lectern, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice even. "You have quite a memory, don't you?" "I've been trained to be observant," he said smugly. "I was a police officer for 20 years. "Indeed you were," I said, picking up a file. "You served in the 17th precinct for most of your career, is that correct?" "Yes." A precinct you shared with some of the city's top prosecutors at the time. You must have gotten to know some of them quite well. Peterson stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? I'm establishing the witness's background, Your Honor, I said calmly, my eyes locked on Croft. It goes to his credibility and potential biases. Croft hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. He knew where this was going. But he couldn't shut it down without looking like he was hiding something. I'll allow it, he said, his voice tight. But get to the point, Ms. Vance. I pressed on. You knew the prosecutors, then? People like, say, Samuel Croft? Henderson shifted in his seat. I knew of him. Everyone did. And you respected him? He was a good prosecutor. Put a lot of bad guys away. A man you'd be inclined to believe. A man you might even want to help, if you could. Objection. Peterson shouted, now fully alarmed. Counsel is speculating. Sustained, Croft snapped. Ms. Vance, move on. Now. This was the moment. I walked back to my table and picked up the sealed evidence folder. Mr. Henderson, you testified that you have a perfect memory of the events. Let's test that. Are you familiar with a woman named Clara Reed? Henderson frowned. No. Should I be? Perhaps, I said, walking towards the witness stand. I opened the folder and pulled out the photograph of Clara and Croft on the boat. Have you ever seen this woman? I held the photo up for him to see, but angled it so the judge had a clear view. Croft's intake of breath was sharp and audible. His face went ashen. He looked from the photograph to me, and for the first time, the raw terror was back in his eyes. Objection, Your Honor. Peterson was on his feet, his face red with fury. What is the meaning of this? This photograph has absolutely no relevance to this case. On the contrary, Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing with newfound power. It is relevant to everything. I turned my full attention to the bench, to Croft. This woman, Clara Reed, was my sister. And 15 years ago, she was having an affair with a powerful, married prosecutor. A man who promised to leave his wife for her. A man who got her pregnant. The courtroom was utterly silent. Ben was scribbling furiously in his notepad. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keys, capturing every word for the official record. Peterson was speechless, his mouth hanging open. Your Honor, I continued, my voice cold and clear, that man was you. Ms. Vance. Croft roared, slamming his hand on the bench. He was on his feet, his face a mask of fury and panic. You are out of order. This is a complete fabrication. Bailiff, take Ms. Vance into custody for contempt of court. But I wasn't finished. My sister was not a fabrication. I shot back, my voice rising to match his. Her pregnancy was not a fabrication. And her death, just 2 weeks after she told you she was pregnant, was not a fabrication. It was a solution. I strode to the clerk's desk and slammed the photocopied journal pages down. This is my sister's journal, detailing her affair with you. It details her fear after you called her baby a complication. I then held up the pharmacy receipt. And this is a receipt for the sedatives you acquired under a false name, 2 days before she drove her car off a bridge. The sedatives that were in her system when she died. Lies. Croft screamed, his composure completely gone. These are baseless, slanderous lies. The courtroom was in chaos. The bailiff was approaching me, but he looked hesitant, unsure of what to do. Peterson was frantically whispering to a colleague. Ben was already on his phone, likely feeding the story to his editor. I turned back to the witness stand, to the stunned Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, my client is innocent. He is a pawn in a much larger game. His only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which brought me, Clara Reed's sister, into this courtroom. This man, I said, pointing a trembling finger at the judge, is terrified of what I might know. He denied our motion to suppress to send a message. He is trying to convict an innocent man to silence me. To bury his past a second time. That's enough. Croft bellowed. His face was purple with rage. This proceeding is over. This case is declared a mistrial. He slammed his gavel down again and again, the sound cracking like gunshots in the stunned room. He then turned and fled, almost tripping on his robes as he scrambled for the safety of his chambers. The courtroom erupted. Justice on the record. It was done. I had detonated a bomb in the middle of courtroom 4B, and the fallout was just beginning. The bailiff finally reached me, placing a hand on my arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." I didn't resist. I looked over at Daniel Miller, who was staring at me with a look of pure awe. I gave him a small, weary smile. I spent 6 hours in a holding cell at the courthouse. It was a cold, quiet place, and it gave me time to think. I replayed the chaotic scene from the courtroom over and over in my head. The shock on Peterson's face, the terror in Croft's eyes, the satisfying, explosive release of a truth held silent for a decade. I knew I had crossed a line. A lawyer doesn't accuse a judge of murder in the middle of a trial. My career was likely over. I would face the state bar, sanctions, and almost certainly disbarment. But as I sat on the hard metal bench, I felt no regret. For the first time since Clara's death, a heavy weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. My release was abrupt. The door clanked open and a guard told me I was free to go. My boss from the public defender's office had posted my bail. When I walked out into the main lobby, I was met by a blinding wall of camera flashes and shouting reporters. Ben was there, waiting for me. He pushed through the crowd and threw a protective arm around my shoulders, guiding me through the media circus. "My story just hit the wire," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement as he bundled me into his car. "It's everywhere. The Chief Justice has already issued a statement. Croft has been suspended, pending a full investigation by the Judicial Conduct Committee. The DA's office is reopening the investigation into your sister's death." It was happening. The dominoes were falling, faster than I could have imagined. My public, reckless accusation had forced their hand. They couldn't ignore it. It was on the court record. It was on the news. The secret was out. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ben's story was a national sensation. He became the face of the investigation, publishing follow-up articles with details from Clara's journal and the evidence we had uncovered. The old detective who had handled Clara's case was tracked down in Florida. Faced with renewed scrutiny, he admitted that then-prosecutor Croft had heavily advised him to close the case quickly as a simple accident to spare the family further pain. The coroner's assistant came forward to say he'd been ordered not to perform an autopsy. The pressure mounted on Croft from all sides. As for Daniel Miller, the district attorney's office quietly dropped all charges against him 2 days after the mistrial. They cited procedural irregularities and the compromised integrity of the court. I met with him and his mother one last time. They hugged me, tears in their eyes. "You saved my boy's life," his mother said, clutching my hands. "You're a hero." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor. I had saved Daniel, but I had done it by sacrificing my own career on the altar of my sister's memory. I was summoned before the state bar's disciplinary committee. I walked in expecting to be crucified. I told them my story, calmly and factually. I admitted that my methods were unorthodox and that I had violated protocol. I explained that I saw no other path to justice, for my client or for my sister. To my astonishment, the committee was divided. While some saw my actions as a fireable offense, others saw them as a courageous act against a corrupt and powerful man. In the end, they reached a compromise. My law license was suspended for 1 year, with a requirement to undergo psychiatric evaluation and ethics retraining. It was a slap on the wrist, all things considered. They didn't want the bad press of disbarring the woman who exposed a murderer on the bench. The final piece fell into place a month later. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, and with his high-priced legal team seeing no way out, Samuel Croft did the one thing I never expected. He confessed. He admitted to the affair, to the pregnancy, and to crushing sedatives into a glass of wine he shared with Clara on that final, rainy night. He claimed he never meant for her to die, he just wanted to calm her down so they could talk. But the jury at his trial didn't believe him. They saw his actions for what they were, the cold, calculated disposal of a human life for the sake of his career. They found him guilty of second-degree murder. I was in the courtroom to hear the verdict. When the jury foreman said the word guilty, a quiet gasp went through the gallery. I didn't cry. I just felt a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. The gavel came down, not his this time, but one that delivered true justice. The echo of it seemed to settle a decade of dust. Life moved on. After my suspension, I chose not to return to the public defender's office. My courtroom battle had made me famous, and I used that platform to open a small, non-profit law firm with Ben, who had won a Pulitzer for his reporting and decided he wanted to do something more. We specialize in wrongful conviction cases, fighting for people crushed by the same system that had protected Samuel Croft for so long. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my office, I pull out that old photograph of Clara on the boat. She's smiling, full of hope for a future she never got to have. For a long time, that picture brought me nothing but pain. But now, I can finally smile back. I can't change her past, but I have honored her memory. I gave her a voice, and I made sure the world heard her story. My name is Aurora Vance, and I am the sister of Clara Reed. And finally, she can rest in peace.